Pa' Centroamérica.
Today we're joined by Dr. Lizbeth de la Cruz Santana, a scholar, educator, and artist whose work bridges academia, art, and community. She's the creator of the Humanizing Deportation Archive, the largest oral history project on deportation to date, and her bordered murals and public installation are example of what she calls Artivism, art as both memory and resistance. Thank you so much, Dr. Elizabeth, to be with us today. It's honestly an honor to have you here in the podcast.
No, thank you for inviting me and for also considering this work, which continues to be timely and just allows us to think about the ways that we could also intervene as people, academia, just people who care about this conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what I love about your work is that it's not only like a storytelling, but an art, but in the form of like murals and this, and also many form of mediums, right? And but I want to start asking you first, like your work is inspired or like I don't know if it's inspired, but you talk about how Borderlands La Frontera impacted you. So I
Right.
wanted to start. How can you share a little bit how encountering that book impacted you, and why do you think the book continues to resonate with artists and scholars today, especially for you?
Yes, and I could tell you, so the first time I ever heard of Gloria Anzaldua's work was when I was doing my master's. Which, when people hear that, right, now that I'm a Chicano studies professor, it's like, wait, what do you mean when you were doing your master's, right? And it was because since I was in K through 12,
Mhm.
undergrad at Fresno State, I gravitated towards learning about Spanish culture and literature. And basically, my formation was mostly based on Latin America, meaning like El Cono Sur, focus on
Mhm.
Chile. So I really
Mm.
didn't learn about Mexico outside of what my dad would tell me, the things that I would see by myself when we would live in Mexico for different periods of time while I was growing up. But I never learned about her work, right? I knew the border
Mhm.
existed because we would see it when we would cross to Mexico driving or through the bus, but the border never felt as present as it does now through my work because my parents would never talk about their migration
Mhm.
stories. It's still a topic that most of my family members don't talk about. But I remember I was taking my first classes at Fresno State for my master's in Spanish. And I went to the bookstore and I was like, hey, let me buy the books that I need to get. And I decided to walk around because I had time that day for some reason. And I encountered like several books in Chicano studies. And I was just like, oh, this sounds interesting. Like, what is this? Because I never knew I was a Chicana either. And
Mm.
I started seeing the different titles, and many of them were a mix of Spanish and English. And I was just like, wow, this is so interesting. Like, what is this? And by that time, I've only learned about Gary Soto because that's the only like Chicano author I read in high
Mhm.
school, middle school and high school. And that was in Lingwood and then in Fresno. And that was it. I had no idea. I never
Mhm.
looked into it. So I remember I walked past and then I see Borderlands La Frontera. I'm like, wow, this sounds cool. Like this title sounds interesting. Let me check it out. That was it. And I like the cover. It's the 50th anniversary cover version. So I opened it. I skimmed through it and I was like, why is she talking about me? Right? Like that's how I felt. I was like,
What is this about me?
yeah,
Type
like
of
why is
moment.
she talking about things that I've experienced, especially studying Spanish literature and culture? You're
Mhm.
made to feel like you don't belong here or there, or that the way that you speak Spanish with your family is not the adequate type of Spanish, right? Because we don't speak like Spaniards, right? Like Castellano, it's
Mhm.
literally colloquial Spanish that people speak. And by then, I was already teaching Spanish at an elementary school, and then also for undergrads at Fresno State. So it just kind of resonated with me so much. I kept skimming and I was just like, okay, I need to buy this book. So I bought the book. And still to today, I have the receipt to remember that day where I learned more about who I am. Because then after
Mm.
that, everything just kind of like started rolling. And I always think about alignment, right? So after that, I became the editor in chief for Fresno State's La Voz de Aztlán, which is a ethnic supplement of the Collegian, which is a student newspaper. And that's where I feel like I had this awakening of consciousness of who I was. And I just started thinking more about who else should I read, right? Because Gloria Anzaldúa is like an icon for us in Chicano studies, but there's many others, right, that are representing our stories, our double consciousness, just who we are, especially as women. And for me, that's where it all started, like that crucial point of like understanding not only the importance of Gloria and Saldua, but also for someone like myself who was born in the U.S. I lived in Mexico in different moments in my life, but I never knew I was a Chicana. So I could tell you the moment I told my parents, I was like, hey, like, am I a Chicana? Because, I was born in LA and, I come from immigrant parents y todo esto. And I was so surprised my mom knew. She's like, yeah, you are. I was like, why didn't you tell me? you know? Like, ¿por qué no me dicen? And it was just kind of like, well, we never thought you needed to know, It's kind of like
Okay.
not even relevant. So after that, I started learning more about this, and I think this is where that moment of knowing who I was just became an extra layer in my awakening as a student, especially while I was starting my master's and understanding the impact of not knowing your history, right? Like who you are and why was
Mhm.
it kept away from me for so long, right? Kind of like the secret that now empowers me to do the work that I do.
Yeah, I love that because I think when I was reading and like prepping for this episode, I didn't know that book, and I was just like,
Mm-hmm.
let me look a little bit, like a little
Yeah.
summary, you know what I mean, what it
Yeah.
is. And I honestly want to read it, even though like I'm not a Chicana. I feel like I resonate a lot with stories that sometimes you are looking to find your identity. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
this is, I tell people this is why the podcast exists, because as a Honduran who moved here at 14 years old, I came with a little understanding of what I am, right? Because of course I moved here when I
Mm-hmm.
was 14, and I already knew I was like Hondureña, and like I'm always being a proud. But I didn't understand, like, now that I moved here, how my identity was gonna be questioned every single time,
Right.
right? That
Mm-hmm.
I needed something to go back, but that didn't exist. Like
Yeah. Uh-huh.
it, I needed something, or like community, and of course I was in high school when I moved here, so like I needed something to fall back. And of course, it was always
Mm-hmm.
like social media at the time, right?
Yeah.
And that allowed me to feel more at home. And then like there were more platform coming up, but also like I couldn't lean to films, because films, there's, for Central American side, it's almost very hard to find. You know,
Mm-hmm.
academia. Even when I was going through college, a lot of academia is very hard to find Central American research. So like it's always beautiful that even when I was going through college, I had like I think it was race theory that I had under the Chicano department. That I was like, oh, like this is all intertwined. You know what I mean? Like I know
Right.
a lot
Uh-huh.
of times, people like to divide things, and it's like how you said, like a lot of times we read when it comes to Spanish, like Chile and like South America and then
Yeah.
Colombia, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, what about our writers? What about or like our own identity? And for example, like for me, the 80s and the and what happened in my country in 2009, like all those
Yeah.
questions, like to me, I always had that, and I always say I was privileged, right, to go to a school that has Central American studies, but it's like how, like, you see what I mean? Like for you it was a book, and for me was trying to find media, to
Okay.
start continue
Yeah.
to be
Mm-hmm.
connected. And I think that that's beautiful that you encounter that, because it's like, oh, now has the answers of what you were looking for, right? But also like for other people, that book might be like understanding, oh, I'm a Chicana, you know what I mean? Or
Mm-hmm.
others like, oh, this is the reason why my parents don't talk about their own migrations in Central America, right? Because it comes a lot from like trauma, right? And I think a lot
Yeah.
of your work
Mm-hmm.
also talks about honoring that part, not only the testimonials of our people, right? And our parents and their migration, but also the silence that comes to that. And
Oh
I
yeah.
wanted to ask
Mm-hmm.
about, like that aspect. How do you navigate honoring both silence and testimony in your work? And like I feel like I'm very interested of like the silence
Mm-hmm.
part,
Yeah.
because it's something that in our community it's not talked about, but it's there, right? It's like
Yeah, it
something
exists. Uh-huh.
que no pregunta, like lo que se ve no se pregunta, right? Like he
Mm-hmm.
said it one day, Adriel decía eso,
Yeah,
right?
Juan
But like,
Gabriel.
but I know
Yeah.
he said it in a different like
Context.
context,
Yeah.
but
Uh-huh.
also like I reflect a lot about my peers who come from family who might kind of left because of a war, right? Or left
Hmm.
because of something. And it's like, well, you don't want to ask, but it's there. So I wanted to
Yeah.
ask, like, how do you navigate honoring both silent testimony and our work? Because I feel like that is so interesting.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. When I saw it, I was like, wow, this is important, right? Because I'm glad people pick up on the silence that is also already included, right, in the murals and digital storytelling with humanizing deportation. Because I could tell you one of the person I would say that basically inspired me to think more about my intervention and as an academic. When I started humanizing deportation, it was in 2016, and I was part of the first group.
Mhm,
And I remember, just kind of being immersed at the border and just everything, like like basically feeling everything at once, and then being able to come back to the U.S. And it was the first term for Donald Trump, so there was a lot going on right in the backdrop.
mhm,
But I feel that my I guess my closeness and just my relationships with the different storytellers and the Humanizing Deportation Project kind of allowed me to start thinking more about, well, what's missing, right? And how can I also help support what they have been doing for so long? And this is where, through, just many talks and just different visits to Tijuana, you get to meet so many people. And even if I didn't help them develop their story, they knew of me and we connected, and it was just like very organic relationships, right? So like over coffee, over meals, it just they saw like that I was kind of more like committed to helping, right? Like besides doing digital storytelling with them. And one of the people that I remember that really shaped the way that I think now of my interventions, his name's Jorge. And when I started thinking about the mural project, he was the first one I thought about. But during that time period in 2019, he was still trying to figure out a way to come back to the US, with a legal pathway or like what's available to him. So he couldn't be in the mural. And then there was two other people that I wanted them to be in the mural, but again, when you are in a very precarious status,
mhm,
or you're trying to find a way to come back home to the US, then maybe visibility is not going to do you good, right? That's their
mhm.
mindset. So you
Yeah.
kind of have to respect that. So even though in his case he's not portrayed in the mural in Tijuana, right, which is the first one that I eventually developed in 2019, for me, I try to find other stories that would also speak about who he is, right? So kind of like filling in that blank that people might not even know, but bringing his story to life through others, right? Because unfortunately, there's a lot of connections between people who, in his case, was brought to the U.S. as an 8-month-old baby and grew up undocumented without knowing that. He just knew he was born in Mexico, but didn't understand the legal implications of that. And just being racially profiled twice, which led to two deportations. So I feel like everyone else's stories also speak to this, right? Of like being criminalized as a Latino male just by the way that you look, ¿verdad? So the way that I basically give quote unquote life to his story, or allow for people to also look through the archive and listen to his story, is that I write about it, right? So this is where I've had invitations to write for like Zocalo Public Square, and I'm like, you know what, this is my moment to write about Jorge, because a lot of the storytellers who are in the mural are getting this visibility additional to the archive, right? Where you're not just clicking on their story, but you get to see their portrait at the border. So this is where I wanted people to see, right? Like listening to someone, like that closeness and the secrets behind, right? Because I heard his story outside of the archive, right? I heard it for the first time with my colleague who was the one who developed the story. And for me, that was just kind of like, wow, they tell us the most raw story first, and then they choose what to say, and that would stay, recorded for anyone else to listen to, like strangers, for example. But those stories, the ones that never made it to that audio recording, are the ones that also inspire us to do more, right? So this is where I think for me with humanizing deportation, it's like I get to hear aspects of their stories that won't make it to the archive, right? Because they choose not to share that. So this is where I feel like art also becomes this venture and showing, right? Of like, these are also the faces that are silenced in the undocumented youth rights movement,
Mhm,
right? So like the stories of people like Chris Kawitli, who I remember I was speaking to one of his friends because they're in Sacramento, and Chris grew up there, but was deported to Tijuana twice. And his friend, was like, hey, let's do something to help Chris come back, X and Y reasons. And eventually his friend just said to me, well, Chris is not the poster baby. We cannot, like, if we do a campaign for him, it won't do much. So for me, that's just also something else, right? Like, sometimes it's our own people, sometimes it's our own circle, or also the way that we think about it. What do you mean by poster baby, right? Like, he's not the
Yeah, that was
ideal candidate. Yeah, I was
yeah,
shocked, to be honest.
yeah, 'cause
Yeah.
that was what my question was like, "What do you mean of
Yeah.
a poster baby?"
Yeah,
Like
like that, like that perfect image, so it goes back to this idea that oftentimes, and I understand why it happens, right? For,
Mm,
undocumented youth, we always like to highlight the valedictorian, the
mm,
undocumented student who's doing the most, right? Because that's what they have to do, like hyper document undocumented, right? To be like the superstar, to say that I did it without having, the pathway to do it. So all of these things, right? So again, those encounters, right, trying to do something outside of the archive also pushed me to say, well, if you won't do it for him in the sense of like, let's launch a campaign to at least bring him back, because his situation is very specific, then for me,
mm,
it's just like, well, what can I do then? Right. So
yeah,
this is where the mural also became a response, and including him in other um, just higher ed programming, for raising awareness about someone in his situation. But it goes back to this idea, right? Why is it that we always think of immigrant stories as some type of marketing, right? That it has to be someone with like the
mhm,
perfect profile for us to feel sympathy for them, right?
yeah,
So, and I connected to the present day too, right? It's just kind of like the way that we talk about people's stories matters, right? What we choose to highlight
matters.
matters, because we're either replicating these narratives, right? Of saying this is what matters, that they're a family person, or that they came here to the US when they were children. Like, why is it that we choose certain, aspects, right? That also speaks about us as a society and what we think matters. But I
Mhm,
think for me, everyone who's in that mural in Plaza Tijuana, whether they tell their stories through digital storytelling, or whether it was just they tell their stories without that, right? There's no recording of it, was very important, right? So many of the storytellers do have a QR code that you scan and you listen to their stories when you get close to the border. But there's others that don't have that, right? Because
mhm,
either they were freshly deported, right? So I wanted them to have some time to honestly, like, let
Look,
them come to
mhm,
terms with what happened. And then there's others who didn't share their story, and they don't have to tell us
mhm,
everything. So I think this is important for me, right? That, and now in my work, I also include the anonymous storytellers, right? That it's only them and I who know who they are, and their face is blank, kind of representing that it could be anyone, and people want to know who they are. But I think that's
mhm,
also an invitation to say, first of all, they don't owe us anything. They don't have to tell us fully anything. Just see the contours in their faces, and think about that, right?
mhm,
Or the lack of face too, because then it also allows you to see that it could be anyone in your immediate life, especially if you're an educator or work in like social services, and or something that has to do with people and the public. So I think for me, that's is where I play around a lot with those silences, right? Because
mhm,
those secrets that we hold, right, I think are make this work even more valuable, because then it pushes a different narrative versus
mhm,
they have to sell us their trauma. They have to disclose all of these really hurtful things that happened to them. And it's not only trauma, sometimes they also tell us their victories, right? But I feel like
mhm.
even with media documentaries that exist about deportation, it's heavily trauma based.
Traumatic. It's
Mhm.
trauma-based, and I
Yeah.
think it's so interesting how you talk because, I always said, like, language is so important in the way we talk and the way
Mhm.
media represent or stories are incredible important, and I get to this term, which is, I think it is cultivating media, so technically how
Oh,
much,
yeah.
media cultivates this idea, right? It's
Uh-huh.
the masses believe, right? And I go back to how media, if in this case, right, just traditional media. not independent or like the type of work that you're doing,
Mhm.
but just traditional media portrays immigrants, right? It
Mhm.
portrays our own people, and it's always about what you said, like very trauma dumping, very like kind of like we are not deserving of just being seen as humans, like,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, of course we're humans, and at the end of the day, I always say like migration is a right, and we all move to and cross borders for many reasons, right? We There's
Mhm.
no just one, and from zero, honestly from baby to like you're very old, and I think the language of what we are telling the stories matter, right? Because
Mhm.
the way media portrays this these stories when it comes to migration then leads to policies, right?
Right.
So
Mhm.
it's like the way media starts to tell, oh, these people are this and that, then it leads to policies that then come back to or like to affect us at the end of the day. And I see that, like, not only from immigrants, immigration reforms or like or immigration policies, but also international. Like in
Yeah.
this case, like for example, I have seen it with international policies that affect Central American specifically, and it's like it all about language, right?
Yeah.
And it's all about
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
a lot of the system and a lot of the field that we that they're owed or explanation of why did we decided to come here, why it
Right.
was so
Mhm.
traumatic to cross, or why we have to flee because of gangs, why did had to suffer, like for them we have to express suffering,
Yeah.
violence, and this on for us to decide to move here. And then when we're
Mhm.
here, we need to continue expressing that the quote unquote like worth of staying. Like
Yeah.
we went to school, we have X, Y, and Z diplomas.
Mhm.
We worked three times, three jobs to make it. But it's like we just deserve of having a dignity life just because we're humans. But
Yeah.
it
Mhm.
it it honestly is the way media and policy and everything make us feel that we have to go the extra mile of like I said, like selling our stories, but
Mhm.
also having to put so many accolades in our life to feel deserving of the paper or deserving
Yeah.
of a status. And I say this because I'm an immigrant myself, and I feel that way too. Like
Mhm.
I'm just a person that happens to be undocumented. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't have to tell you that I am. I don't have to,
Mhm.
because you should just
Right.
respect me because I am a human being,
Yeah,
because I,
exactly.
you know what I mean? But it's just it, and also like it's the conversation like of what it means of like storytelling and this, and I always feel, being always fascinated by media, and I love how you portray it like in murals, right? Because sometimes it's like when you go to an art museum, right? And like for me, like when you
Mhm.
see murals, you always think, what is this the artist behind this? But in this case, like the stories, and when you portray
Mhm.
people with no face or no name, that can be you, and you put
Exactly.
yourself there.
Mhm.
You
Right.
put
Yeah.
yourself there. You start thinking this. Eso puedo ser yo. Eso puede ser mi amiga. Eso puede ser like my mom, like my or people those who are first gen who their parents crossed that, and they might have know the full story of what it was crossing the border. You know what I mean? Because
Mhm.
a lot of times parents don't want to go through that remembering, right? And like as you said, like sometimes we need to hold space for the silence and to acknowledge that they don't owe us that. But at the same time, I think too, as a first generation, sometimes we go back like, well, I would like to know, right? But
Yeah.
it's
Ajá, muy
just
cierto.
like
Mhm.
but you can just understand that maybe that silence is because it was so traumatic that they just want to be like in a place of gratitude when it comes to here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I also think, right, and just kind of bouncing off what you were saying about like proving your worthiness, right? And you don't
Hmm.
have to be an immigrant, just be a person of color, right? To
Hmm.
prove your worthiness and having access to higher education or to live, literally just
Hmm.
to live. But I think what you say also, the fact that oftentimes, like, and I could tell you, like, my mom, when she crossed, right, like, we never talked about this until I was part of this project, Humanizing Deportation. Then I'm like, hey, I'm going to Tijuana, my first time at the border, at least on that side, right, without having to cross without my family. And I think this is where they started telling me things like, hey, like, this is how I cross, but nothing more, verdad? So I think for
Mhm.
me, it's just like, I can't push them to talk about something that they don't want to, but they
Mhm.
slowly start kind of like sharing things, just to kind of like have that comfortness. Or now that both my parents have helped me do several of the murals, like my dad helped me with the Ciudad Juarez one, and I took him with me because I was like, hey, my first time in Ciudad Juarez, you better come with me, right? Um, and he was the one who inspired that mural, him and one of the storytellers. So I was just like, can you come help me? And then my mom helped me with a deported veterans mural and the one that's in Fresno también. So I think for me, it's also their way to give back, because not that they had it easy, but they were able to legalize their status, right? They're permanent
Mhm.
residents, and my dad did it through marriage, my mom through the amnesty. So I think, we don't have those venues. We don't have amnesty right now for this group that hasn't benefited
Mhm.
from any type of like relief, right? So I think for us, it's very important to highlight that, right?
Mhm.
That anyone should intervene and could intervene, but we have to be careful in the way that we do so, ¿verdad?
Mhm.
Because we're trying to do good, right? So, like, yes, let's protect the undocumented youth or the DACA recipients, undocumented people as a whole, but let's do it in the way that they don't have to keep proving why, right?
Mhm.
I think
Why?
that's the basic underline of my work. It's just, they, at least for undocumented childhood arrivals or people who overstay their visa, the fact is that they migrated to the U.S. when they were children, and that should be enough.
That should be
¿Verdad?
enough. Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but that's
that's
not how
true.
the society works. Yeah, yeah.
It's not, and
No.
I feel like, a lot of my work focused on Central America, and I always been fascinated about just learning, right, history
Mm-hmm.
about Central America and media, right? That's not what we're here. But
Yeah.
I also feel like, for example, when it comes to Central America, specifically from the 80s, right, how
Mm-hmm.
the gangs and probably, I don't know if you know, the gangs started here in LA, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they were deported back to El Salvador, and then now it became like a huge thing, right? Growing up, and how stereotypes like towards Central American has been, right? So when young men were fleeing that, right, when they're
Mm-hmm.
trying to, like you said, they're just migrating because they want a better life for themselves, or maybe they just want to be with their parents who migrated years before them.
Right.
They're
Mm-hmm.
just being criminalized just because they're men, and because they come from a country that have this history with gangs, right? And it's like, okay, but like, in my head, I'm always like, well, can we go back where it exactly started,
Yeah, the
right? And
origin. Mm-hmm.
the origin, right? And Central America has a lot of U.S. intervention, right? We have had
Mm-hmm.
civil wars during the 80s. And I think a lot of the art that you do to also focus on that, right? To remembering the past programs of like deportation, but also had those that affect today. Because
Right.
I always say, si uno no estudia la historia, we tend to repeat it,
Yeah,
and I
or
and
we
I
could
feel like,
study it to repeat it. That's what
yeah,
I'm
we can
seeing
say
now. También, it goes both
yes.
ways. Like,
It goes both ways,
it's a
yes.
play-by-play book. It's just different contexts, different people in power,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just thinking of like the most recent events that have happened, right? It's just,
Yes.
without saying too much, I think it's just like we also run into that danger of like, yeah, let's learn about history to repeat it.
Mhm. Which
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how, you know what I mean? I feel like history is there
Yeah.
for us to learn and for us to reflect, but it's crazy to
Mm-hmm.
think that now in present there's some people who just read it to repeat it,
Yeah.
which we should be learning from what happened in the past that did not like
See,
did
to
any well,
prevent these things to happen again.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit of that, like, um, how does remembering past like deportation program, like history, this have shaped or response to today enforcement, and
Mm-hmm.
how like your work, right, that keeps the memory of those affected by, but also the memory of people from the past, but also from the present.
No, yeah, and I think I saw the question right. I think it's like we're basically referring to what's going on right now, right? Like the mass
Hmm, hmm.
deportations, this tactic by the current administration to literally take out huge amounts of brown people, undocumented, and also anyone that is racial profiles or
Displaced.
anyone that falls within that machine, right, of deportation.
Hmm,
But I remember when it was being talked about in the media or just kind of like the press giving voice to the current president. I was in Fresno and I told my family, like, and my parents know about this, right? It's just Operation Wetback, like even the name, right? I
hmm.
think I was in the Central Valley when we had immigration rates too, at the beginning of the year. So you're trying to find a way to support, right? And I remember I was like, wow, this is so similar to what happened, right, during Operation Wetback. The name again, it's doing something, right? Like, how do you identify who that fits that profile, verdad?
Hmm,
And I think for me, I remember I was sharing on social media. I was just like, no, people listen to me, people look for me and they ask for resources. So let me share what I know. So
hmm.
I curated a list of like, hey, if you want to watch a film, this is one you should go to and watch. It's free. So I was looking for free, accessible like resources online to share with people because I think people were shocked that this was happening in the magnitude that it was so visible. And
Hmm.
and they need to know, right? Immigration rates are not new to the Trump administration. I remember growing up in the 90s in Los Angeles, there was talks about it. One of our babysitters worked in the garment industry in Los Angeles, like downtown LA. So I remember hearing all of these conversations growing up about people running from La Migra and just, like you grow up with these things. So you're kind of like prepared to learn how to like navigate this. But when it's your first time encountering this, right? Because I understand how people could freeze or they start
Hmm,
like naturally responding through it through emotions. But I
hmm.
think
Hmm.
what's really important for us to focus now is how do we help people equip themselves with their rights, right? Because we all
Yes.
have rights, undocumented or not. We all have
Hmm,
rights. But unfortunately, even then, that's not enough, right? Like you showing that red card might not be enough, the one that has your rights, right? And to tell immigration, like, hey, I don't want to disclose anything to you. There's a lot of things that are happening because they're using force and violence. But I
yes.
think what's really important for people to understand is that this is not the first time that it has happened. It's literally a machine, a deportation machine that is meant to not only deport people, but keep them in detention centers to profit out
Hmm,
of them, right? So I always say this: the moment that local police have a quota to give, for example, tickets, traffic tickets,
hmm.
that becomes an issue. The
Yes.
moment that immigration or ICE, right, has a quota for how many people it needs to arrest, detain, right, each day, that becomes an issue. Because then you're
Hmm,
inviting for collateral damage or inviting for tactics that are not aligned with what they should be doing, if that's their
hmm.
job. Right. So I
Yeah.
think this is where people need to start thinking about this. And I'm really happy to see so many people intervening, right? Like in Los Angeles and finding ways to navigate social media censorship as well, right? So i
Hmm,
i know they're using the music festival as a way to allow for people to see what's happening. And also we're using hashtags or just when we're sharing this information saying icy roads, right, instead of saying ice, right? So I think people are organizing because they're also learning from the past. But
hmm.
unfortunately, like you mentioned as well, this is repeating itself. So when will we see the end of it? And I do worry now in the sense that we're seeing, and the most recent one too, which I think happened today, I believe, in Texas, right? This white male decided to shoot into a detention center there and killed an immigrant, right? And then there's, I think, one or two more who, the latest thing I saw in the news today, who's in critical condition in the hospital, right? So
Wow.
when people feel entitled to do these things, that's also another thing that we need to look into because that's urgent. The moment that immigration decides to kill an immigrant in public, That's
Mm-hmm.
another issue too. And it gets recorded, right? So yes, there's evidence now to kind of keep them accountable to what they're doing, but the fact is that I don't see it I don't see this is going to stop anytime soon.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, they're trying to send a message and you don't want to be that person that they're using to send that message, but that's where we're at. So for Operation Webpack, right, a lot of people who we were even citizens just for the fact that they spoke Spanish or they looked Mexicanos, right, like
Mm-hmm.
Mexicanos, that was enough for you to be taken and quote unquote repatriated to Mexico when even you were not, so it's just kind of like allowing us to see this. So if people are listening and they want to like see a film that kind of gives them that, look into the past, that it's a little bit more accessible, I would say Mi Familia o La Familia,
Mm-hmm.
and it's on YouTube for free. So I would
Okay.
say watch it. Jennifer Lopez comes out in it, and all of these great actors as well. So I think it's a film that allows you to not only understand the Mexican American family, but to also acknowledge the fact that immigration enforcement is generational now for many of us.
Yes. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like you said, I think, seeing it, it has hurt, right?
Mm-hmm.
Seeing how the treatment, and like you said, at this point in what a conversation that I have often with my mom, right? It's like this is not about who's here legal or not. I don't think they care. I don't
No.
think they
Mm-mm.
care, and I think it's just about a message and like
Yeah.
intimidation, and to use, like you said, like as a quota. They're trying to meet a quota for I don't know what, and it's just harming our community and harming in a ways that you know a lot of people are living in fear. A lot of
Yeah.
people are going missing. A lot of people are
Yeah.
being detained and sent to countries that have never been before. and
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and like sometimes I think even like the Supreme Court, right, just allowing for racial profiling.
Yeah.
It's like what is, to me, right, it's like, so when is the check of point, like the power checks, whatever it's like, the
Ajá,
legislation,
sí,
the
sí.
presidential and the Supreme Court. It's like you're allowing for this and allowing for something to be, again, to be repeated, right? That happened not
Mhm.
only here, right, before that, that happened many years ago, that happened in other countries, right? And it's like, like,
Yeah.
you're starting to see it, right? So, and I love that you share a film, because we have art in media like that, right? That it's like it's not only entertainment, right? And it's not only
Right.
media, but
Mhm.
also educate us. And I love that you also use a form of artivism, right?
Mhm.
And it's like,
Yeah.
a film is an art piece, and like a mural too, and a book,
Mhm.
and a poem, and music. There's many art, like media's way of protesting. There's many ways of advocating, or even resistance, right? And I wanted to ask about that, right? Because
Mhm.
we just talk about all these horrible things, right? Like, like
Yeah.
history repeating
Mhm.
itself, and all the things that they've been doing, right? Like, and that is embodying, like, allowing other people to feel entitled to do
Yeah.
them themselves, not only an institution who's being completely violent to our community, but now allowing other people just go for it because they feel like empowered,
Empowered.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly, empowered, right?
Validated. Sí.
Validated.
Mhm.
And it's like, well, I can do it because no one's gonna tell me nothing. And it's like,
Yeah.
just at the end of the day, pure racism, right? So
Mhm.
how do you see art functioning at both survival and protest, and what the responsibilities that come placing art, in places like the border, in places like
Mhm.
detention centers, in places like
Right.
that, is a like, it's a representation of how can, like, suffering, right, and a representation of
Mhm.
violence, but putting art on those places to enact as an act of protest.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can, like, kind of like a little bit of that artivism, trying activism
Yeah,
that
see
you
the
talk about. Yes.
activism aspect, right? Because like
Yeah.
why art, right? And it's something that for me when the moment where I realized I was like, wow, we could do something here at the border it was in 2016 when I first saw it for the first time. And I remember I was recording a video to share with my dad. I'm like, hey, this is how the border looks like. He had crossed there like multiple times back in the day when it was in that border fence that we see now. And
Mhm.
I remember I was like, wow, this is a horrible place, ¿verdad? Pero I realized it was a contrast because you have these metal bars and it's a fence. It's not a wall, right? Which I think a lot of
Yeah.
people with the Trump administration, the first time that he was trying to like build more, I had all of these extensive, talks, and I was just like, you know what? It's not a wall. Like, it's not a physical wall. It's a fence, and it has holes. It's like all beaten up, ¿verdad? Porque ha pasado
Yep.
muchísimo tiempo. So I think one of the reasons why I chose art is because that is one of the mediums that the community at the border has been using, right? Whether that be like small messages that they leave, like written just with like acrylic paint, or that they draw, that intervention has already existed, right? So this is part of like that ethical way of working through this. It's not, you're not inventing something new, but you are intervening in a different way. So the way that this artivism aspect came to be is because I was listening to all these stories, and like I mentioned earlier, it felt like we needed to do more. But
Mhm.
what does that more look like? And I remember I applied to this fellowship and I received it. I was like so thankful because it's public scholarship. And I was just like, wow, that's who I am. Again, going back to Ansaldo, I was like, wow, this is who I am. I find a term to who I've been, like the things that I've been doing, because it kind
Mhm.
of like was like a shock factor in academia that someone in Spanish was doing something that was not traditional and that was seen like as if I was doing anthropology or sociology. I'm like, no, I'm in Spanish. So I think that also has to do a lot with, my formation. But I think for me, I I saw art as another way to heal because again, I'm not undocumented, I'm not an immigrant, but I'm listening to these stories and I just I have this privilege to be able to come back and forth y todo eso que viene
Mhm.
con, being born in the US and having that passport.
Mhm.
But recognizing that that shouldn't keep me like feeling bad for myself, if that makes sense. Cause this is, I think people fall into that idea of like, oh, well, I can't do much, but or they just become like social media activists. I'm like, no, 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 you gotta do more because there's a reason why you have access to this, ¿verdad?
Mhm.
And I think for me, it became this compromiso with the community. And I remember I messaged Robert Vivar, who's one of the people represented in the mural. And I was like, hey, Robert, like, I want to do something at the border. I'm thinking of a mural. And he's like, let's do it. And I was just like, okay. So he's the one who helped me a lot, honestly. And I remember I was like, hey, I'm thinking of painting down at the border in La Playa. There's nothing there. And, he's like, yes, let's, you have my support. Let's do it. So for me, it was having the community's blessing. So here I'm working through like ethical ways of doing this, right? So not erasing anyone's art, working in a space that hasn't been touched, right?
Mhm.
But then
Mhm.
also doing it with the community I'm trying to represent, right? To illustrate. So this is where that work bloomed, right? And for me, that was so important, having their blessing, because I didn't want to repeat these aspects of academia, just coming in, taking, and not giving back, ¿verdad? It's just
Mhm.
como deconstructing all of that because it's wrong. A lot of people have built their careers on doing that, and the communities don't even have access to what you're writing about them, the cultural materials that you're creating with them. And I was just like, no, like no podemos hacer eso. We're all people. There might be conflict within us, but that work should still stay, you know, should still be uplifted, right? Because like, again, that's what matters. So
Mhm.
that mural happened and it was done in two different stages. I worked through the pandemic as well, and I finalized it in 2021. And again, the idea at the beginning was to do it just with them. ¿Verdad? So that was part of my activism piece as a scholar, to say, hey, I'm gonna like, I want to go paint with you guys. Let's spend time together. Let's paint together and let's put your portraits on the border fence. And the reason why was because a lot of the times when I would go to Tijuana, for some reason we would meet in playas at Tijuana, and they would always say, like, this border fence always reminds me of my condition that I can go back home. ¿Verdad?
Mm.
And for me it was just like, that's horrible. So I remember I went at the beginning of 2019, And I had told my partner during that time, I was like, hey, like I want to do something here, and I pointed where. He's like, yeah, do it. I was just like, okay. It was his first time at the border, so yo no sabía. Like, I was like, let me tell someone who doesn't care about this in the sense that I do, verdad? Como alguien que está nuevo en esta conversación. So I pointed to the wall, and I still have that photo of like, this is where I want to do it. Eventually, like I said, I got this award, and I had money, and it was a pocket of money that didn't have to go through like the traditional channels of like you get a refund, like refunded. It's like different, so I could buy paint, which
Mhm.
oftentimes with grants you can't do that. So this is where you also, as a scholar, we have limits of how the money could be used. So I go to Tijuana, we work together, and it happens, and we're like, okay. And we didn't know it was gonna blow up the way that it did. ¿Verdad? And I'm very thankful for this is where media also plays a big role. Associate Press, um, Al Jazeera, like all of them, they were super crucial in people knowing about this at the border and giving a face and a voice to deported people. And I think for me, the QR code was so important because for me, it wasn't not only about let's paint together, let's have your portrait at the border and what it means for you as a person, but I want others to listen to the stories I've been listening to feel what I've been listening, like feeling, because it was a lot,
Mhm.
and you're carrying all of these stories with you, and you're trying to make sure that you're doing as best as you can to honor their stories. And I'm like, no, people need to feel this because then I want them to care the way that I care. Y así pasó, right? So I think over time, that medium of painting stories just became more accessible for creating more awareness about what the Humanizing Deportation Archive was documenting, but also to speak to the current times. But that's a contemporary immigration issues, asylum, the deportation again of people who grew up in this country but don't have the documents to, prevent that deportation to happen, and family separation. And eventually for me, what happens to the children of the deported?
Mm. Mhm.
¿Verdad? Like that's that group that I honestly care for the most because those are children who are US citizens and are also being impacted by our policies and hatred towards brown communities.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's like so important, like you said, like the blend, right, of multiple
Mhm.
mediums of art and the QR codes and like how art it's also memory, right? It's
Yeah.
also like a protest, right? Because you are
Yeah.
putting the stories that they don't want to hear. They
Mhm.
don't want to hear
Exactly.
that. They want to silence us. That's the reality. They want to silence us. They don't want to hear us. And it's like, okay, this is a painting, right? Of
Yeah.
remembering their face, remembering, but also the added aspect of like they're telling their stories, right? To the other
Yeah.
side of media, right? Like digital media. And I think that is so beautiful because like art and media working together for a, a protest that doesn't look like what a quote unquote protest is, right?
Yeah,
Like you're
exactly. Uh-huh.
marching. It's a protest that it's I wouldn't say silence, right? But it's a protest that is there. That is like
Mhm.
you can visibly see it, and this is a call to action for you to see our stories and what we've gone through, but also it's all to action and specifically changing what that represents, right? Like the border, right?
Yeah.
For the owner that we're talking, right? The border, where the border often represents where you cannot go, now has a face
Yeah.
of a person who's like, this is my story that happened
Mhm.
through borders, right? So I
Yes.
think it's something beautiful, honestly, and like I like I honestly I think when I go through like the streets and I see murals, I'm always questioning. Like I'm a very visual person. I'm like, oh, like I wonder
Mhm.
what inspired this, and then
Yeah.
like I wanted to ask, like, how was the role the institution like should play in, like, for example, to make things like yours, right, more
Yeah.
sustainable in art and archives? Because I know right now with everything that been going on, there's not a lot of
Uh-huh.
funding, right?
No.
And then
No.
cuesta dinero, we
Yeah.
know that paint is expensive,
It's
time is
expensive. Yeah.
expensive, and like how can we support as like this, right? And like work like yours and
Mhm.
not only how can we support, but also what can you tell to someone who they didn't know that activism was a thing, that blending
Mhm.
this type of media or this aspect it's is there? What would
Right.
you tell them to for them to start something, right? A painting, a mural, or like photography, or just a like multi digital archives.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think right now we're talking, I think for me and I think you mentioned museums before, and the reason why this work is not in museums is because it's not supposed to be housed inside a place where maybe you have to pay or who has access to a museum. And
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes it's not our people, right? Like oftentimes
Mm-hmm.
we don't get to enjoy that, right? And maybe it was just through a field trip that we went to a X and Y museum, and that's it. But that because our
Mm-hmm.
parents are working, it's not part of our like we don't have time for it or we don't have the money for it, like the resources. So the
Mm-hmm.
fact that this work, and it also speaks about other public murals, the fact that it's out in the streets, ¿verdad? Making a space beautiful or reclaiming it to honor someone's stories, to take up space, like take up the
Mm-hmm.
border in that case, has political connotations, like it or not. At the end, it will be read in that capacity. Um, the mural that we're referring to, the Playas de Tijuana mural specifically, it's at the westernmost point of the U.S. Mexico border on the Mexican side because we cannot access the U.S. side. So that also has another impact, right? Like who is the main viewership for that mural? And for me, it was the first tier would be like the storytellers represented in it and their family. The second, which I am still thankful that I got to witness, is also people who see themselves represented in it. That's so supported communities, families impacted by family separation, and then everyone else, right? Then anyone else who gets to go to Tijuana and see the mural in person. But I think the fact that, doing this work, you also discover what it could be. ¿Verdad? Because the intention was this a small project with no más para nosotros, but it became public, ¿verdad?
Mm-hmm.
Because you're painting in a public space. And the response that I received during this whole period that we were working in this project, it was like we needed this, if that makes sense. I had a lot of
Mm-hmm.
advocates in Tijuana, storytellers, and just people in the community who would say, like, we needed something like this in Tijuana, ¿verdad? To not only raise awareness, but to honor those who have been displaced from the country that they recognize as their home. ¿Verdad? But to also speak about different dynamics, that it's not only people with a criminal record that get impacted, ¿verdad? They'll become part of this pipeline to deportation, but it's also deported veterans, dreamer moms. It's a myriad of people that fit this profile now. And I think for me, I see art as this portal to also illuminate, right, the fact that nothing has changed in regards to let's fix this issue. It's more like let's further criminalize this aspect. So with art, it's an invitation. And I could tell you right now that I'm working on this. I'm working on a bicoastal mural that is in Fresno, California, and Bushwick, so in Brooklyn, in New York. And the idea for this mural is to allow for us to now see the interior of the US as a expansion of the border, because we're seeing it, right, with immigration rates. And unfortunately, I believe to date, we have had at least 20 undocumented people who could be considered part of the Dreamers or DACA recipients who have been impacted by detention. And I think for me, that's important for people to understand that even when you have something like the DACA program, which is the first deportation, you could still become vulnerable to be detained, and eventually, hopefully not, but be deported from the country that you were raised in, right? And maybe this is the only language you speak, the cultural references are here, not in another country. So it goes back to what you were saying earlier, right? Of um, the context of Los Angeles and the gangs that were created there and then deported to other countries and vice versa, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
this cycle of us in the US not being accountable to our interventions. So I want people to understand through these murals is that we do owe something to this generation, that we literally like provided the tools for them to be raised as US Americans, No, we do owe them something, because the moment that someone goes to school, and it's something that you could listen to in most of their stories, is that they recite the Pledge of Allegiance. And still to today, they know it. All of their cultural references are US based, the cartoons that they grew up watching, the sports that they like, and just all of those things. So I think for me, it also becomes, artivism becomes this portal to understand human rights violations. ¿Verdad?
Mm-hmm.
So again, having a piece of art that you can literally touch. So this is what I love about this work, that it's out in public versus a museum, is that you could touch the art. That's part of it. Like, I want people to touch it, to literally allow us to help fade, right? The faces, because it's supposed to show that the how time is passing and nothing is either done, or these stories keep changing because el tiempo pasa, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
there's violence, and allowing for people, or pushing people to wait for something to happen in response to their, their activism. Like, people are not just waiting around, they're doing something, but the fact is that the law is waiting, pushing them to wait. ¿Verdad?
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like art becomes that portal, and where we could actually start understanding, like, who are the humans behind all of these narratives, right? That are heavily anti-immigrant, and just based on colorism and socioeconomic status, and invite them to also participate, ¿verdad? To see that
Mm-hmm.
human face behind it, and to maybe understand why someone has a criminal record. Like, what made
Mm-hmm.
them a criminal? Or why is someone
Yeah.
undocumented? Like, what led to that? Because people don't choose to live that life, right? There's systems in place that push for that to happen. And again, it goes back to this idea that we have quotas, right? To arrest, to detain, to deport. So, God forbid you don't fall into that group that is needed to have someone profit out of you, out of brown bodies at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. And I think it's so interesting because I honestly, for what you're saying, I'm reflecting, right? When
Mhm.
you were saying like a lot of people who, or a lot of other artists and other scholars have done the work for our community, but that work is not accessible to us, right?
Yeah.
And what I was saying is like when I went to school and I went through academia, right, and I was in college and writing research, none of the research that focused on Central America was written by Central Americans,
Mm,
nor
mhm.
I had access
Yeah.
to that before that, right? I had to be in a higher education to be able to read that,
Mhm.
um for example the article, right? Or like arts that are, for example, focused on Central America. There are also a lot of artists that are Central Americans. It's like, but at the same time, it's like what you said, like I remember one time, and I was so happy, by the way, that
Mhm.
um there was this art exhibition about Central American artists. And I remember driving from LA to San Francisco and came back the same day just for that
Right.
art, right?
Ajá,
But
sí,
not
sí.
but not everyone has that access for driving,
Ajá,
right? Of
sí, sí.
so far to see themselves, and I think, and also grateful because for me to do that drive was because I wanted to see art by my community,
Mhm.
right?
Right. Yeah.
And for me that was important, right? But I don't think a lot of people knew that there was a curated art exhibition from Central Americans, you know,
Yeah.
um that I wish it would have more accessible, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Or even like express that there's something like this existed, right?
Mhm.
And I think that what you said, like when we have murals and there is art in public places, right? It's like where is the intended audience, right? And the accessibility of us seeing our stories represented, right? In
Mhm.
a form of art, but also in a form of resistance, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
also how does resistance look like, right? Like you and I agree with you. Like a lot of us who grew up in this country had access to schools, right? Because of prior protests and legislation that led us,
Oh,
like
yeah. Mhm.
for someone like me, right, to go to school and was able to get a degree, right? Even as a non-documented person. But then now it's like, but now what? You know what I mean? Like, what
Uh-huh.
how do
See.
I navigate this system? Because there's no guidance, there's nothing there. um and I also always look back to what resistance looks like, right?
Mhm.
For me, going through film and saying, well, I want to study film because I want to change the narrative of Central Americans in media. That is my own art of resistance, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Uh-huh.
and then I see your work of artivisms and scholar and you as a professor and teaching and all this aspect as resistance and um as part of changing that narrative, right? Or changing of educating our communities, right? And making
Mhm.
things accessible. But also like in my own life, right? I see resistance a bit more different, right? As an undocumented person, I see my resistance as showing joy, right? As
Yes.
showing
Yeah.
joy because
Uh-huh.
and lately I've been very I've been focusing on that, right? Because as
Mhm.
you said, and we have talked about a lot of media of how they're represented on on the news on traditional media,
Claro.
but also
Mhm.
social media and this thing of sharing violence and trauma, and it's very easy for people to share, like the rates, which is very brutal, but also like what about when our community is having joy, right?
Right.
And
Mhm.
the resistance and not only like just being community, right? Because that
Yeah.
is just music or art or colors. Those are something that bring us a feeling of home, a feeling of acceptance, and a feeling of just being able to exist, right? So I
Exactly.
wanted
Yeah.
to ask you about that, right? Now that you're working in a bi-coastal mural, right? Because a lot of people that before they felt, well, like the border is dividing me, right? But now it's like the
Mhm.
city is dividing me. This
Yeah.
this corner is dividing me, right? How do they see those murals, or like, or we hope for the murals, but also like how do you see the resistance and joy being implemented in art, right? For our
Yeah.
community.
See, and I love that question porque it makes me think about the Fresno mural, which we installed in May of this year. And just to kind of bounce off from what you were saying, like now that I'm a professor, right? And I'm a professor in a place that is not my home, right? I'm in New York. I'm from California, and like, I'm like, that's my
Mhm.
home. But for some reason, life brought me here. So I understood right off the bat when I landed here and I started my job. I was just like, oh, that's why I'm needed, because I'm teaching these classes as a Latina professor, right? First generation. I'm not a white woman teaching these classes. I don't come from an Ivy League education. I come from like the Cal State, Fresno State. I also did, I had some time at Fresno City College, Long Beach City College, and I eventually went to UC Davis. So I come from like the public school system since kinder. So I think I resonate so much with my students because we talk to each other in a way that we understand each other. They don't have to explain to me why they are the way that they are, why they care about the things that they do, right? So I think we meet each other at the same space. So the fact that I had three students join me in Fresno to install this mural speaks volume, right? Of like our commitment to, and you mentioned earlier, which I didn't talk about, fundraising or like having money to buy paint, to travel, to buy everything that you need. So I've been very blessed that, outside of me having to fund many of these things by myself, I've received fellowships because I've applied to them, right? And I'm trying to find money here and there that I fall into as, due to the positionality that I hold. And I
Mhm.
think that's important, right? That my storytellers, the people that I collaborate, they don't have to do that work, right? I think this is where we come in and we have to push for that. And I think that's my way to also not burden them with the fact that, hey, we need money. Like, hey, we need this. It's just, I take care of all of that. It's a lot, to be honest. That's the stressful part about this work. The
Yes.
pushback, finding a wall in the US, those esas cositas that I don't want to talk about either, but I think people need to acknowledge the fact that this is not easy either.
It's nice, yeah.
right? Especially during the current times that we live in, and me now in New York having to find a very welcoming space for us to paint and cosas así, ¿verdad? But I think that teaches me also to keep going because and it's crazy how life works. And I think it's just I get all these people messaging me or calling me like, "Hey Liz, like, como te agradezco por esto." And I'm just like the fact that, you're not only becoming this source to empower your students, but it's also like the storytellers, right? Who would trust you. So I think that layer of trust also keeps pushing you, right? Como decir, oh yeah, I have this barrera to cross right now, whether that be funding, finding a space, or, convincing people that as an academic that my work matters to academia,
Hmm.
which are
Yeah.
conversations that I've had this past year, which is like, your work is not important for us. This is not valid. And yeah, like what do you mean? So I think for me, having people like reach out, and like right now I'm working on three murals at the same time, and it's just kind of like people call me like, hey, like thank you for including me, or like they see the portrait that I drew of them, they're like, oh my god, like, so it's people feel seen and valued. I think that's something that is a gift, so
Okay.
I think navigating these challenges, right? Like my dad always says, you need these teachers, these challenges, because they're gonna push you to what you need to be next. But it
Yeah.
sucks. It sucks.
Yeah.
But I think for me, seeing the response from my students, ¿verdad? So I was saying how I had three students say, hey, like we want to go with you to to California. First time going to California and to Fresno, ¿verdad? Es como decir, oh my God. So we made it happen. It's like I hired one of my students through my own like fellowship that I have, and two of them paid for their own flight. So it's just kind of like when people care, they'll do whatever it needs to be done to be there.
Hmm.
And it was also
Yeah.
meaningful, I feel, for them based on the conversations we've had. They wanted to meet the storytellers represented in the mural. They
That's
they
good.
wanted to continue this work outside of like just New York, verdad? And to have that sense of humanity, right? Of like, let's have a moment to be together. And I think for me that just kind of shows like the intervention you can have when you work through things that represent who you are, verdad? Like we all have
Hmm.
like our ethical ways to do things, but I think for me it's just be yourself, do what you need to do regardless of the pushback that you might face, because at the end of the day, at least in my case, I think about it, my sole identity is not being an academic, verdad? My identity is being a human, right? So it's just the fact is that I navigate different worlds at the same time, but I always give priority to the community that I
Hmm.
collaborate with, and who for some reason see something in me, and they push me to become that person, verdad? So I think for me
Hmm.
that's what got me through grad school. That's what's getting me through now this new era as a in my career. But I think at the end of the day we have to realize who are we, like basically a quién tenemos que escuchar and whose voice matters and whose
Hmm.
voices should be silenced when we're trying to do work that has a social impact aspect to it, verdad?
Yeah.
So I think for me that's the value of this, right? Artivism and being able to tell stories through mediums are accessible to communities, because at the end of the day, like I always push this, right? The my main audience are the people represented and the ones that see themselves in it,
Hmm.
because for so long, like who has been telling their stories, right? And they have been telling their stories, but the fact is that they don't get picked up by media. And
Hmm.
I could tell you, just to kind of like go on to the next topic, but when we talk about deported veterans, media has done a great job in highlighting the Latino experience, the Mexican veteran who gets deported. But when it comes to Black veterans, there's hardly anything. If it's not something
Hmm.
that they themselves created and somehow, garnered that public attention, because their voices get dismissed from interviews, from like platforms. So I think it also, again, it speaks to our society, like whose voices do we tend to push and like listen to and elevate, verdad? Through film, music, there's so many interventions that we could do through art, but at the end of the day, it's like the moment that they get recognized, I think you do something to them. Like there's this light that is given, verdad, to their efforts and their movements. So I think that's an invitation for the public, verdad, to say hey, maybe I'm like gravitating to these very like recognizable stories that keep repeating themselves, right? Decir como this outstanding dreamer. But what about people who didn't even have the choice, verdad,
Mhm.
to get to that point and they're doing something else with their life? Like, when are we going to expand our notion of deservingness, and why do we push for those categories to say this person's worth our time?
No, definitely, definitely, and honestly, all that you share, it's I resonate a lot. You know what I mean? I think
Mm-hmm.
um when I and while you were talking, I was reflecting on my own work, right?
Right. Uh-huh.
Like creating, like I said, like this podcast, right? Like I created it because I didn't see myself represented, or like have
Yeah.
the space for others in my community to come and talk about, like, for example, what you share,
Yeah.
in the work that affects our community, and the reason why I do film, the reason why I work in many aspects, right, of media
Sí,
and then
sí.
the
Uh-huh.
different things, right? And it's because of that, like the collaboration and the work that we do is, for me, I always said, like, for me is that I don't want to see my community being erased anymore, or
Mm-hmm.
being put into connotation that just diminish us as human, like it's,
Yeah.
and that is, and I love that you said, like, for you it's humanity, and I think the for me is also the same. Like, for me, it's like we're just human beings that have stories, that
Mm-hmm.
have, you know that our lives is just, and I often say this, like, every single person has a story, no matter their
Yeah.
athletes. Tu
Exacto,
abuelita,
sí.
que
Mhm.
tal vez no se graduó de los
Yeah.
it's like
Uh-huh.
the storytelling of them, like, is always an advice, and como es un fruto de mucho, like, how can I express it, like, there's stories of our grandparents, the story of our parents. It's knowledge for us,
Oh,
and
yeah.
there's
Uh-huh.
always an advice, and there's always we something we can learn from each other. And
Mhm.
that's how I see my work as a storyteller, from in this side, digital media, right? And I love that I see it from you, as of someone who, like, in activism. It's like the storytelling, maybe in a different form, and in the blend of
Mhm.
media, but always focusing of what it is to be human, and what it feels to be put in a place that is, we're looking for people that they want to feel represented, right? That
Yeah.
there is a space for us there, that no matter what media, stereotype, politics, and these systems, and um police and ICE want
Sí,
to tell them
sí.
who we are, we're not that, and this is giving us that opportunity to share from our perspective.
Sí, because I love that you mentioned, like, ¿verdad? Like our grandparents, they have that knowledge, ¿verdad? And I think about it like growing up in Mexico too. I think this is where my interest also in Spanish came from, because I was thankful that my parents, since I was little, like I learned Spanish. I was in dual immersion in elementary. So I think for me, just noticing the value of being able to communicate with them in their language and being immersed in the culture that where my mom was born, donde mi papá creció, I think for me that was so valuable. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't have that, ¿verdad? But I think they do have access to other things, right? And I've seen, like, referencing like social media, like TikTok, they sell these books where, like, ask your mom these questions, or like the papa, like, there's this book, have them fill it out, because we see value in our stories and
Mhm.
acknowledging where we come from so we could know where we're going. Because a lot of the times
Mhm.
I see the way that this country is going is because we don't know our origin story, or our origin story comes from very violent histories, ¿verdad?
Mhm.
So I think like these spaces, but like the podcast, allowing for others to come in and like share, just their work with others who are interested, right? And I think that's very
Mhm.
important to create these spaces, because there's this new generation coming into academia. First gens are no longer going to be first gens. There's going to be others like us. So how do we make sure that we retain them for them to feel valued, seen, supported? So there's this wave right through like
Mhm.
academia, social media platforms are providing that space for our voices to
Yeah.
be heard and valid.
Yeah, and your art too. for remembering that
Yeah,
history
remembering.
and the history in our past too. And
Sí, sí.
before we close, I wanted to ask if there's anything else you wanted to share.
Yeah, so just kind of like blooming from this idea of like being in a space like a platform, like a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes what I realize is that now we're in New York and we're kind of like having this space with my students where they just come into my office and we just like kind of like
Mm-hmm.
talk about everything that's going on or just think about other stuff that's happening like in culture, and we always find ourselves just kind of like doing a rundown like a podcast, verdad? It's just like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
how's your day going, cosas así. So we're starting a podcast together. They're no longer my students, they're alumni. So I'm like, all right, we could work together on something like this, right? Like a no nomás como un pasatiempo, but something that I feel like we just need to get it out. If that makes sense. Como like
Mm-hmm.
we just need to talk about things that matter to us. And I say this because I listen to a lot of podcasts like Se Regalan Dudas for like that mental health aspect también, and all of these other podcasts that keep me in tune with what's going on. But I feel like we bring something different to the sense of like we're organizing all of these different like cultural events at school. And in the past, we've done many of them. One of them, the one that we want to start off with, is Eslabon Armado came to our campus, and we want to talk about why. And it goes back again to this idea like we wanted our students who are from Mexican backgrounds to feel represented through music, to say, hey, it's okay for us to learn about corridos in an academic space. It's good for
Mm-hmm.
us to know about the accomplishments from like first generation like artists who are coming from nothing and building something for themselves, verdad? So that's our idea. So we're starting that podcast and we're going to talk about just basically like what we've done together, that the murals, our
Mm-hmm.
classes together, and just what else, like we're all women, and I think that's important coming from different backgrounds as well. So we hope that it's for us, but then we want others to also engage in conversation with us, and we'll see where it goes. But for now, that's the idea, and we have a name in mind. Right now, we're playing with it, pero se llama El Cuarto PR because that's where we started in my office space, and we just started El Cuarto, and that's it. Yeah,
I love it. I love
yeah.
it. And no, thank you for sharing it. And honestly, wishing the best luck on that
No, thank you.
podcast. I
Yeah,
love podcasting because it's community. Like it's
sí,
hablando.
sí.
And I felt conversation that happened. And I was telling you before we started, like a
Ajá,
lot of time we just say, with my family, I'm like, venite al cuarto a hablar. You know what I mean? Like
ajá.
it's
Vente
just a
al cuarto
place
a
where
hablar.
we,
I love it. Sí, sí,
you
and
know.
it's also a way for you to also keep memories alive.
Mhm.
Memories
Mhm.
alive,
Yeah.
people's voices alive, and invite others to join that world that maybe we don't have access to.
Exactly, exactly.
Hmm.
No, but wishing the best luck. I cannot wait when it's out. Let us
Sí, sí.
know,
No,
okay?
thank you.
Yeah, so we can share with our platform.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah. But before we close, I wanted to have a space for you to share where people can follow you at that
Oh,
moment
yeah.
right
See, so I believe I have the handles for everything in social media, Lizbeth
now.
de Santana, and you could also look for my website. I have everything linked there. It's lisbetdelacruzsantana.com, and there I would highly invite people to, even if you Google Playas de Tijuana Mural Project or the U.S. Child Rivals Mural, you could find the images. So I'm working on creating interactive murals, so you don't have to be in these spaces to see it, verdad? Like you could
Mm.
see it beyond. So that's part of this idea of like creating public art, that it should be
Mhm.
accessible even if it's through an online medium. So those would be the best places. Lisbeth de Santana.
Love it. Thank you so much. And then everything will be linked down below. We usually link everything there. But I just wanted to
Mhm.
for people. But
Awesome.
no, Dr. Elizabeth, thank you so much for taking the time. It has been an amazing conversation. We are an hour and 20, and I know we could have gone for longer.
Oh, thank
But
you.
we
No,
could,
thank you.
yeah.
It was fun. Yeah.
Yeah, but before we close, we just wanted to shout out Sergio, which is your
Yeah.
friend, and that
Sí, sí.
he communicated with our producer Brenda and made this episode possible. But thank you
Yeah.
so much.
See, thank you, Sergio. Yeah, we go way back, 2016. Hmm.
Oh, damn! Like
Yeah, I know.
almost 10
Almost
years.
10
Wow.
years. Yeah, I know. Sí,
Well,
sí.
thank you so much. Thank you
Mhm.
so much.
América,